who are listening to this. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share about this paper, which is rooted in my practice at the moment, working with different organizations, Christian Aid and Tier Fund, looking at some of this issue. I suppose because of the short time that we have to do this, I'm just going to highlight a few things from the paper. And so I want to talk about three things briefly. One is diagnosing the problem at hand. And then the second is the complexities of the solutions that is holistic. And then the third one is looking at case studies of hope. So let me start with the diagnosis of the problem. I think from an African perspective, from an African theological perspective, we cannot look at the climate crisis in isolation. And the reason we cannot do that is because the issues around climate for us is connected to other issues. And so when I think about the issues around climate, I look at the connections of it. In this particular case, I'm going to talk about it in the sense of there's been a triple trauma that has been caused in the case of Africans in this conversation. And the triple trauma revolves around the dislocation of African identity, racial injustice, and climate injustice. Those three categories, they bring trauma in its own. So hence the word triple trauma. Speaking about that first aspect of that trauma, the dislocation of African identity, I think Africans, of course, before enslavement and colonization, we inhabit and are rooted in a geopolitical space we now refer to as Africa. Of course, that doesn't mean that everybody was getting on well, but at least we have a shared identity. But slavery and colonization means that family, that identity was dislocated, so that today we talk about Africans, continental Africans, we talk about African Caribbeans, and then we talk about African Americans. Now, today, you and I, we've so got used to those terms that we don't probably think too much about it. But cast your mind to a time when there were not these categories. I just want you to just cast your mind that there was a time in history that you wouldn't have those descriptions of African Americans, African Caribbean. But today we so got used to it that somehow I think that masquerades the trauma or makes us to think that all is well. And so because of that dislocation because of the diasporic nature of that fragmentation, we have Africans all over in the Americas, or what we now call North America and South America, and then in the Caribbean in that sense. But the second aspect of that trauma is racial injustice. Underpinning the transatlantic slavery is an ideology that is very dangerous, and one that saw African people as properties, that saw them as commodities. So you can talk about the commodification of Blackness in a sense. So that's the first layer of that ideology. The second layer was the need that Africans were inferior. They need to be civilized. Africans were not intelligent, so they need to be civilized. And then the third category of that ideology was that they needed to be saved. Hence, we have Christian mission in that sense, working alongside to a lot of extent with colonialism or colonial authorities. They needed to be saved. In fact, on the third category there, one of the tasks of African theologians, because it was said that we needed to be saved. And so the argument of African theologians is actually African traditional religion prepared a lot of Africans for the reception of the gospel. It was something that prepares us, that makes us to actually be receptive towards it. And so one of the first tasks of African theologians was to actually begin to wrestle with the terms that were labeled on African traditional religion, such as pagan, heathen. Their task was to begin to deconstruct some of those terms in that sense. I don't have time to begin to unpack that, but that was the second category in that sense. And then a third of that trauma is the climate injustice. which is where I think this conversation is very important. And I think oftentimes I think Western historians, because we like to think about industrial revolution as a kind of a progressive ideology that helps in terms of globalization and its successes, I think there is a way we divorce the history of the Industrial Revolution from the transatlantic slavery and colonization. But actually, if we look at it in an integral sense, and for anyone who looks at history properly, you will realize that industrial change prospered at the back of the Atlantic economy. Cotton that became the main sort of commodity during the industrial change that replaced wool, which wool was the commodity before. Cotton that replaced that was taken from the slave plantations in the so-called New World. And also the people who were picking those cottons were slaves. So you can't talk about industrial revolution without this Atlantic economy, the slave economy. Now, what is the impact of the Industrial Revolution on climate crisis? Scientists would tell us, I'm not a scientist, but scientists would tell us that that is what has accelerated our climate crisis till today. And so I'm talking about a triple trauma in the fragmentation of African identity, the racial injustice with the ideologies that perpetuated the dehumanization of African bodies, and then the climate crisis that has resulted from that. So if that's the diagnosis of the problem as a triple trauma, what is the solution? I think one of the things I'm putting forward is a Pan-African theology, because the impact of the fragmentation of African identity has affected our theological output, in the sense that today there are different approaches to theology that we do. There is the African approach, there is the liberation approach. So there are Black theologians, there are African theologians. But if we're going to address these issues together, we need a Pan-African theology that goes beyond African theology, that goes beyond Black theology in its various incarnations, or in the various contexts that it emerges. Where am I seeing this happen? Speaking about case studies of hope, Racial Justice Advocacy Forum, which I'm part of, set up by the Baptist Union of Great Britain and Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, is a space where I see this conversation happening at the moment. It's happening in other parts of the world through, for example, in the United States, there is Transatlantic Roundtable on Race and Religion, TRRA, some of you will be familiar with that. But in the UK context, Racial Justice Advocacy Forum is a place where it's helping to begin to shape this conversation and having that holistic approach to this issue. Because I think the thing is this, if that triple trauma is the problem, racial injustice is a symptom of the problem. Climate injustice is a symptom of the problem. And I think at the moment, if our strategies is around racial justice and climate justice, it doesn't go far enough, because we are treating the symptoms. The real problem is the impact of slavery and colonization on African people. And to begin to address that, we need reparative justice. And reparative justice is very holistic. I know it's very controversial, but it's very holistic. But it will help us to go to the root and to the source of the problem. I'm going to leave it there because I've only got 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Israel. You packed a huge amount into that 5 minutes, and I think have given us some leads and some threads that we will probably want to pick up in our questions and conversation later. I'm going to move us on now to introduce Graham Adams, Reverend Dr. Graham Adams, an ordained congregational minister, a tutor, and the MA programme leader at Northern College. He teaches mission studies in the context of global Christianity and religious diversity. And his recent book, Holy Anarchy, invites a reimagining of the idea of God's kingdom. And it's ideas from that book that are shared as part of this paper. And Graham, we're very interested to hear you introduce your paper to us now. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm just going to show a PowerPoint. Thanks very much. It's great to be with you. It feels amazing to follow after Israel, who has already said so much more specifically what I'm perhaps doing a little bit more abstractly. So forgive it for being a little bit abstract, but I think I see some synergy already. So I'll just go through this. Holy Anarchy as an alternative of living possibilities. Let me just explain a little bit what that's about. In short, though I've not quite said this explicitly in the paper, that it's about trying to offer a different language, a different framework, a different imagination to see how it helps. It's about recognizing that people contribute to ecological justice at many different levels and paces. And it's about trying to hold that mess together in a common concern about the system that Israel has already outlined. Overall, the argument is that Holy Anarchy, an alternative vision of the kingdom of God, offers a new approach to the problems and solutions of the ecological crises. If the goal that we're looking for is to foster ways of being which honor and further the integrity of ecosystems, then the root itself must be ecological, a web of interactions. There will be, though, a coalition of chaos amongst many imperfect efforts to care for the earth, each seeking to subvert damaging systems while recognizing that none of us does everything. So why the kingdom of God as holy anarchy? The term anarchy, I use it because of that sense in which this alternative kingdom is an anti-kingdom, a subversive kingdom, a realm of anti-domination, where archy is about rule over. So anarchy is a realm where there is no ruling over, no domination, a place of mutual flourishing between all agents and creatures. It's a counter-imperial argument, a counter-imperial movement, a counter-imperial reality, but there's always an element of ambivalence about it, because whatever language you use, we're always embedded in complex systems where even our best intentions can in themselves be corrupted, and we can't be entirely in control of what we do. So that it's good to be alert to the ambivalence, even as we seek to be on the right direction towards a new future. By changing the language, it hopefully pushes against the staleness that might emerge if we just keep using the language of the kingdom of God. We don't notice the politics in the language. So by problematizing the language, by offering alternative language, it helps us to become alert to the danger of staleness and to the prevalence of politics in our terms and our practices. So the dynamics of anarchy are recognizing there's always a network of patterns to do with economics, to do with race, to do with gender, and so on, a network that denies fullness of life to all creation. That network is driven by vested interests, which must constantly be exposed, and empire epitomizes these vested interests. Colonialism, used capitalism, causing excess deaths, and damaging the earth, the root of the system that we still live in. So Holy Anarchy as alternative model here, it consists of exposing these systems. It points us to alternatives, which are not always found in neat places, but are found in awkwardness, and they're found in impurities, and they're found in cracks. This identification of alternative movements in odd places, sometimes in odd movements, it engenders solidarities among the different. So it's not about a pure group of people doing everything purely right, but a coalition of people emerging who are in solidarity with strangers across borders, across loyalties, building movements of unexpectedness. So in that sense, anarchy has a lot in common with this term ecology, I think. And the words have a synergy, and the ideas have a synergy with them. The imperial economy drives the ecological crisis. Holy Anarchy exposes this and calls for missional responses. And I outline 5 marks of anti-imperial mission. It builds bold but also humble communities. Or movements that are evoked by this process. So it's not innocent. No movement or community can be entirely innocent. We are all entangled in these webs of interaction, both for good and for ill. But we do have a responsibility to host the vision that we pursue, even in our imperfection. We are, using the term that Al Barrett and Ruth Harley use in Being Interrupted, we are edge places, we are ecotones. places of in-betweenness, in between the entanglements of the system and the future to which we move. We engage in ecological empathy, trying to be attentive to the cries and the groans of creation, lamenting those groans and committing to a new future, upholding those things in tension. So as I say, no community or movement is the whole. There's a chaotic contribution that we each make, part of an ecology, a network, a complex web. So there's no single solution, but multiple contributions and possibilities. It's important to recognize the limitations of what we do, but also, crucially, the asymmetries which still hold us, in the sense that some people have greater responsibility in this, some parts of the world have greater responsibility in this, greater, the impact that has been made in some parts of the world is so much more considerable. And the inertia in some parts of the world is also so much more considerable. We seek to do chaos in the sense that we are pushing against a system of false order. Empire, it's false because it doesn't actually achieve the order it claims to achieve. It damages so many people and places. So we are therefore pushing against that, disrupting the dynamics of false order. We embrace chaos, and I find the model of blue theology helpful here, of affirming the oceans and our place as water people, what it might mean, what we can learn from those of us who are more landed people, what we can learn from people of the sea more, and the fluidity, the unpredictability, the movement. We embrace the chaos of this movement, and we are, in a sense, chaos, a solidarity of diverse movements and contributions, with not entirely predictable outcomes. We have some goals in sight, but not even everything that we do will achieve the things that we seek. So faith and grace are a matter of ecology. Holy Anarchy resonates, I hope, with ecological vocation. It calls us to be attuned to the critiques of the imperial system. It calls us to be alert to the legitimate awkwardness of what we do, the ambivalence, the contradictions, the imperfections in what we do in our efforts to subvert and to be alternative. It's good to be alert that we're not wholly innocent in this. We're always entangled, but still we can make a difference in small ways. And we can be attentive to the networks of agents and interests, which are different from us, so that we build alliances of strangers in coalition with one another towards seeking deeper solidarity. So with what shall I compare the kingdom of God then? It is like Holy Anarchy, an ecotone of potential, a butterfly of unpredictability, a tree network, a fungal system, a shoreline of land-sea interaction, a flow of maybe, a depth of lament, a growing wave of something coming, a solidarity of interspecies conspiracy, and an alternative ecology of living possibilities.
Thank you so much, Graham. And you've introduced, again, so many different ideas in that presentation, and you managed to do it in 5 minutes. So that's very, very grateful and most impressed. It's good because it allows us, I think, up to 30 minutes to have some conversation now about these papers. And those of you who are online, I invite you, if you have questions, to try and put them into the chat, and we'll try and take as many as we can. And then in the room, I shall start by inviting anyone here if they have a question that they would like to ask to either or to both of our contributors this morning. Has anyone got something burning? Well, while people think, can I ask Israel, just listening to what Graham was saying there, it seemed to be encouraging kind of diversification of chaos, and that being the where we will find our alternative ways of being. And that seems to sit in juxtaposition to your argument for a kind of synthesis, if you like, of these African theologies. I wonder how you react to the idea of chaos, or does that sit with your proposal, or what do you take from that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me with Graham's proposal was, again, a kind of a holistic framework in addressing these issues. I love how Graham is using the term chaos and anarchy, and I think it's very beautiful, very helpful. And I suppose the way my entry point, or a similarity I would see in our conversation, is at the moment, our emphasis from a Western perspective to address climate crisis is rooted in ecology, is rooted in what I would describe as a green agenda, where we are thinking more about preservation of wildlife species and green spaces and desert areas, which I'm not knocking, by the way. I know they are totally important, but I think we need anthropological perspective to add to our ecological perspective, because, put it this way, if my anthropology has been messed up and dislocated, then I think that is very important to have that. So my holistic approach is how we look at ecology and anthropology. How do they intersect in this conversation as a framework? And so people will talk about the brown agenda, which actually looks at this, and I hear Graham talking about a blue theology. So there is green theology, there is brown theology. And I think, I suppose, a synthesis of a brown theology would be the olive theology, which will be all encompassing, that we need the green theology, but we also need the brown theology that brings that racial dimension to that conversation, that anthropological perspective, because it's been messed up. And so I think that there is a synergy in those ideas when we look at it from an olive agenda.
Thank you. Yeah. Got any questions in here? I think, oh, David Coleman, you got a question.
Okay, just trying to type it because it's a long one.
Oh, feel free to say it, that's fine.
Okay, here we go. Very interested in what you're highlighting about the dangers of othering and making inferior, which ultimately oppresses the whole creation. So what I'm saying is your initiative is of benefit to all, but what we need to be careful of is how easy it is then to slide into what we've seen when people talked about Black Lives Matter, and immediately we had this knee-jerk reaction from the right wing saying, yes, all lives matter, which is a way of ignoring the specific value of the Black Lives Matter initiative. I'm, from sitting here in the global north, I'm welcoming the specifics of what Israel's offering, and say that a biodiversity of approaches is beneficial to all, rather than trying to dilute it and even it out. The very particularity of what Israel's talking about, I think, is of benefit to all of us. You see what I mean?
Thank you, David. Yeah. Do you want to respond to that, Israel, or even Graham as well?
I think, if I may start on that, one of the things I've been reflecting on recently, because at the moment we're talking a lot about decolonization in various themes and areas. And my recent reflection is around, actually, we cannot have decolonization, either climate conversation or whatever it is, until we recognize that until the colonizer and the colonized are decolonized, we cannot be set free.
Yep.
So I think we need an intercultural approach that embodies both, so that we can both be mutually set free as it is. And so I think that has been my approach, how we do that, but not demeaning African agency or Black agency, which is very particular and very strong. And there's a reason why it is, because the pendulum over history has swung a different way. And to balance and to correct that, you need some strong measures. It's kind of like when we talk about equality. Equality is not enough. You need equity.
Yep.
Because if you only have equality, that assumes that everyone is starting from the same place, or that the playing field is level. But when you recognize that actually it's not, then you need equity to balance your equality. And that is where this conversation and the particularity of it is very important. But nevertheless, realizing that we cannot be set free until there's a mutual set free. That is, the colonized and the colonizer need to be set free in order to experience true liberation in that sense.
Good.
Thank you. Graham.
Thanks very much for reflecting. I think what Israel just said, but perhaps a slightly different language. I think there's always an interaction between a universal story, a big story, and particular stories. It doesn't make sense to deny that we're part of one big story, in the sense that we all share a common home. So what does it mean to live as part of as part of one creation? The universal story is Earth and the ecology, the networks that we are embedded in. But yes, there are obviously particular stories within that, and particular asymmetries that matter here because of empire. So we are all, the colonization affects us all, but how it plays out obviously has inequitable effects and dynamics. So as Israel was saying, it's right to give greater voice to those that have been silenced by these dynamics, to be attentive to the groans of creation and the cries of the oppressed, and how those things are entangled with each other. And so people like me need to shut up.
Not for the next 20 minutes.
No, you don't.
Good. Victoria, thank you. Do you want to come and join me here in the centre?
They were great, really great presentations. Like, it's really weird looking there.
It is.
I really enjoyed both presentations. I think struck between Lawrence yesterday gave a really good presentation about kind of Christianity and its relationship to empire. And so Israel, when you talked a bit about how African traditional religions kind of were a stepping stone for African people to come to like Christianity, so this is kind of going to as well. So I'm going to bring you into groups, right? Like this idea of like fulfillment theology. And I wonder, when looking at the environment, how useful is it for us to uphold Christianity as the paradigm that enabled the transatlantic slave trade, enabled the Industrial Revolution, etc., to show us the answers for the environment? Or should we actually be going back to these African traditional religions that we overlooked hundreds of years ago to see if they might actually have the answer to our problem that we've created as Christians?
Let me put that to Israel first.
I think that's a good question. I suppose there are two ways one can look at that question that Victoria's just posed there. One is, when I think about Christianity, I don't enter Christianity through the Reformed theology or the Reformation period. I think for many Western Protestant Christianity, we enter Christianity through the Protestant Reformed period. When I look at Christianity, I look at it through the patristic lens with African church fathers. So there's an argument that whose religion is Christianity? There is that argument. And I suppose how we answer that question will determine how we see the relevance of Christianity to African Christians. I see Christianity as an African indigenous religion. And the reason why I'm saying that is because Christianity is as old, almost old as the continent in some sense, because it goes way back to the patristic period with church fathers, African church fathers, with theological institutions emanating in Alexandria and Carthage, with African martyrs dying for their faith and etc. So it goes way back. And so this historical assumption that Christianity was brought to us by Western missionaries is still something we definitely to contend with. in a lot of ways. Yes, Christianity came through that, but that's just one of the channels when you look at it historically in that sense. Now, for those who will see Christianity as a Western religion, that is where that argument begins to come in, that, okay, Christianity has actually been used to oppress us, so we need to look elsewhere. And there are those who will look to African traditional religion in that sense. And again, this is where it's very fascinating, because African traditional religion and culture actually offers us ingenious perspectives on how to preserve the earth. So I, as an African Christian theologian, I do borrow some thinking from African traditional thought around some of these issues. So, for example, there are parts of Ghana where you are not allowed to fish on a particular day of the week. I think it's Tuesday. Those are when you think about that indigenous wisdom there, if it helps to balance overfishing. And there are gems like that is spread across African culture and customs. It would be like hunters shouldn't hunt in that particular jungle because of something else. And those indigenous practices does help in a lot of ways that we can borrow some thinking from African traditional religion. But my own premise is that I see Christianity as an African indigenous religion. Because it goes way back to the patristic period, which is very close to the time of Jesus in that sense. So I try to sit in that. That's my positionality, but yet borrowing tools from the religions and the customs around that in that sense. Sadly, some of those indigenous customs have been thrown away because of globalization. And because of colonization and neocolonization, some of those ideas, indigenous ideas, have been thrown out, which is very sad for someone like me. But nevertheless, I think if we can regain some of them, they are definitely useful for this conversation around climate crisis.
Graham, is the Western Church the place to start, or is the Western Church the problem?
Yes. Well, yeah, again, similarly to Israel, I think, indigenous traditions clearly have so much to teach Christian traditions in the sense, and I think the idea of blue theology and red theology and different sorts of theologies from different sorts of places and different sorts of traditions has to be part of the picture very much. And of course, what it urges us to do is to recognize that Christianity is not a monolithic thing. It has, if not multiple stories within it, it has certainly different modes, ways of being Christian. Kosuke Koyama pointed out decades ago that Christianity tends to operate in a teacher complex, thinking we're the ones with the ideas to share with others, but actually calling Christianity back to see itself as a two-way street religion, a religion which is always dialogical, always open to receive from that which is other than itself. And in that mode, which, certainly how I see it, it's Christianity is called to be constantly self-critical, constantly decolonizing its own imperialism. So yes, it clearly has been an agent of imperialism and colonization, but at the heart of it, it is meant to constantly decolonize that very dynamic within itself. And to do that, it means being attentive to, listening to, learning from other traditions, helping to create, co-create space in which there is mutual learning and unpicking and disentangling of the systems that harm us and others. Indigenous traditions need to be part of the conversation, and Christianity needs to keep working at decolonizing itself.
Okay, I think there's things going on in the chat which we in the room can all see, and hopefully you online can all see as well. So I won't read out all the comments, but there's a question from Damon for Israel. Can return to the philosophy of Ubuntu be part of the solution to the climate crisis? Does that philosophy find a place in Pan-African theology?
Yes, I think it's very useful because I think if part of the problem is individualism, sometimes disguising itself as independence, then Ubuntu helps us as a theology of interdependence that says, I am because you are. It can help us to think collectively and not just of our own. It's not I think, therefore I am. It is I am because you are. And so it's a very useful framework, especially in terms of Pan-African theological thinking. In that sense, it's very useful. But the other thing I need to mention here is that one of the things I'm discovering at the moment is that there are different gems in African proverbs and in various African customs that elucidate Ubuntu in different ways. Different regions of Africa have their own Ubuntus as it is. And so we must tap into that. If I borrow one from my own language, for example, I'm Yoruba from Nigeria. And one of the proverbs in Yoruba, we talk about Agbajo Wolafin Soya. And what that simply translates to is that you need multiple hands to carry a load. As it is, one hand is not enough to carry a heavy load. You need multiple hands to do that. And so we must seek, one of the tasks as African theologians that I'm trying to encourage is how we seek out some of those gems that helps us to capture some of this thinking. So definitely Ubuntu is a very useful African philosophy in this sense.
I have a question to both speakers. Israel, you began, one of the things that you pointed out in your discussion was the question of, we're going to have to venture as the church, certainly in the West, to begin to wrestle with the question of reparations. And because we're Westerners, we tend to think of that in economic, monetary terms, which I'm not too sure is very helpful, but nevertheless we do that. And I wonder if I could be a little bit cheeky and ask if you've got a figure for us. You know, how much is it going to take? But before I ask you to answer, I just want to draw your attention to a paper by Jason Hickel, Christian Dorninger, Hans-Peter Weyland, and Infant Suwanli in Global Environmental Change. I think this is a bombshell paper, but nobody seems to be commenting on it. It's called The Imperious Appropriation in the World Economy, the Drain from the Global South Through Unequal Exchange between 1990 and 2015. And they admit the difficulties of measuring that, but effectively the highlights are that the extraction from the global south to the global north through this unfair exchange mechanisms around about 10 billion a year, which is which if you add it all up with all the labor involved, they reckon about $242 trillion in 2010 terms has been drained out of the global south with our current economic architecture. 242 trillion. So suppose with that in mind, what is the right figure? Which is a quarter, which is interesting. The quarter of the global North's GDP is predicated on that theft. So how much is enough for reparations when we even begin to talk about not even the climate injustice, but the injustice to everybody because of this economic system?
Thank you very much, Kevin. Your question is going to open up some interesting conversation on reparations. Because as I said, it's a controversial topic because of how the conversation is unfolding at the moment and the power dynamics that is still at play in that. But I suppose a starting point is this: there is no amount of money that can pay for the damage that has been done. There is no amount of money that can pay for the damage that has been done, because I think people might not realize the impact of that damage. So for me, it's only of recent that I'm beginning to come to terms with the fact that I've lost a family member. And so I find myself going through a bereavement process. Each time I'm having this conversation, it's like I'm reliving trauma in a different way. And the reason for that is just thinking of the fact that I've lost brothers and sisters that we're not, I see other people and we call them African American, thinking that's part of my family, African Caribbeans, and somehow we are estranged. And the legacies of colonialism continues till today. I think it's ongoing. And so there's no amount of money that I think can pay for the damage. But I think when we talk about reparative justice, I suppose there are two ways one can look at it. One can look at it through a lens of retributive justice, which perhaps sounds more like revenge. And one can also look at it through the lens of restorative justice, which perhaps will lean more towards a New Testament concept of reconciliation and healing. And I would say I lean more towards the order of restoration. And I know a lot of people who are talking about it leans towards that as well. And so sometimes people mishear us and think, oh, this conversation we're having it because we are greedy or because we want money. No, it's not about money. I think it's about coming to terms with something that went wrong in the past that has affected our present, that needs to be corrected, that there is an imbalance, that is an injustice that needs to be corrected. And so sometimes people will even use the word repairing justice in terms of reparative justice. You're repairing the damage that has been done through dialogue, through conversation, yes, is money an important part of this conversation? Yes, there will be some exchange of money, but no amount of money is enough that will pay for the damage, because the damage is huge and it's ongoing. In that sense, how Africans are still being viewed in various conversations and the various things that has happened in that sense, and the loss of history, the loss of memory, historical amnesia. There's just so many aspects of it that you can't quantify in money. But reparative justice helps us to begin to put a construct around healing, around forgiveness, around let's talk about this, let's face up to the fact. And I think the problem is, I think within the British, my observation within Americans are having this conversation, and they've been having it for a while. We are beginning to have this conversation, but I think there is something about British politeness that doesn't want to have this conversation, that we don't want to ruffle the feathers. And I think that we need to have a way to overcome that. And I know oftentimes we compare ourselves to America as well and say, well, we are definitely doing better than those on the other side of the pond in that sense. Maybe perhaps we think like that because we haven't faced up to that history. And I think this is a moral reckoning for us, a moral awakening to the fact that we need to have this conversation. But then that conversation becomes problematic when people simply start thinking, oh yeah, why don't you just forgive and move on? And yes, I'm all out for forgiveness. I'm a Christian in that sense, but I also understand very well that justice is a big part of forgiveness. It's a big part of the whole system. So we can't just talk about forgiveness and not talk about justice and not talk about restoration in that sense. So I think it's very important that we have this conversation, but I would say that no amount of money is enough to pay for the damage.
Thank you. That's a very powerfully made point. I wonder, Graham, what role you think money or financial compensation or some form of restorative justice has in a holy anarchy model?
So I'm sure others have written more about this, the Zacchaeus story, but it's just so striking, isn't it? So Jesus declares salvation has come to this house on the basis that Zacchaeus has declared he's going to repair economically the wrong that he's done. I mean, he hasn't done it yet, but he says, I will. So it is, I think, in a sense, similar to what Israel was saying, that the biggest revolution involved here is the change of mindset and the sort of the turning around of worldview that is, yeah, and I see David's written more than repair. Yes, that is the hardest thing, and no one, yeah, we seem to be in Britain really good at avoiding this challenge. We've become incredibly skilled at it, at the cost of what Empire has done, because we don't want to face up to it, and because that's the harder thing to do. But that's part of the alternative imagination that is involved, I think, and it's because our imagination, not only has our will and our habits been colonized, but our imagination has been colonized. We can't conceive of a different horizon because we're so embedded and caught up in this one, and this way of being, in this, well, not even in this history, because we don't even know our own history, but in this money should play a part of it, but no wonder we don't even get to have that conversation properly, because we're so conditioned to avoid it, and find all sorts of ways to continue to be. I think Cynthia Malabida talks about a sort of moral oblivion, in the sense of an obliviousness which is both willful and unconscious at the same time, and that we find all sorts of ways to keep denying the reality, both the reality of what we are doing to the earth, but of our complicity with it over centuries. So there's a lot of unpicking to do, which is painful and traumatic in itself, but clearly not as traumatic as what others have faced in far more extreme ways.
Yeah, Chrissy, a quick one though, so we've got a couple of minutes left, or 1 minute left.
Israel, I wanted to pick up, and I think it's probably misunderstanding. No amount of money can recompense. And so the tendency is we tend to think in these ethereal, abstract, spiritual terms, theological terms. We were struggling yesterday why our congregations can't listen to someone like Kate because they're too dangerous, they're too threatening. That is because the church doesn't have a prophetic voice. And the information that Kevin just gave there is the very information the church should be broadcasting to the world, highlighting to the world that a quarter of the wealth between 2009 and 2015, which was extracted from the global south to the global north, we are all complicit in that. And then if we're silent about that, we are part of the problem. So the prophetic role of the church is actually to say the global north has robbed from the global south in the last X years a quarter of its wealth. How many trillion?
242 trillion.
And because our churches are silent and we don't preach this on Sunday, we don't publicise it in the media, our congregations think that someone gluing themselves to the M25 is wrong, because we're not exposing that. So I want to bring a balance to what Israel was saying there, that no amount of money, and yet we need to publicise the amounts of money that is being robbed from our brothers and sisters.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to pause the conversation there. I'm pretty sure that some of these themes are going to emerge in our next session anyway. But at this point, can I say a huge thanks to Israel and to Graham for your contributions and for stimulating such a discussion that we want to carry on with, really, if we had more time. So thank you.